Every change or transformation that is successful and that is significant and that is impactful shares one crucial component that is actually often overlooked or seen as less important than it really is. And that is creating a story around this change, creating a narrative that drives a transformation, creating or crafting a story that really helps people understand what is going on, helps them develop trust and certainty towards knowing what we're doing, and it invites them to partake and co-create a certain change or transformation. We call this behavioral intervention the public narrative, and we will explain to you where that came from in a second. And this is an intervention that will help you strategize and operationalize the way that you tell stories and the way that you drive and activate and engage stakeholders in any type of change by using storytelling. To do that effectively, we first have to dive into why stories are so important. And what we see is that each and every change or transformation that has a compelling narrative, so a good story, really helps changing the success of this transformation. What we see is that it really helps mobilize and engage stakeholders to achieve business objectives related to that change, because now they understand why they're doing it. This is about meaning making, which is hugely important to humans and the human brain. So understanding what is changing and why this is happening. And aside from that, a good story, when it's told consistently, also signals that the leadership team behind this change, this could be organizational leadership, this could also be the project team or the steering commission, as long as they communicate consistently and they share their message, they share their story, this is making a huge difference on signaling how well leadership is aligned and that you can trust in them, that they can help you through this journey, not just to see change as a static thing or a process, but really as a path and a journey. Now, McKinsey did a huge study on this a couple of years back. Of almost 2,000 organizations partook in this transformational change journey study. And what they found was that changes with a good story, transformations that have a good story where leadership is openly communicating about this and honestly communicating about this, these types of changes are 8 more times likely to succeed. 8 times more likely. That is a huge difference. Also, when we see senior leaders consistently telling change stories and also updating these stories that are putting some light and emphasis on the organizational goals and where we're going, these types of transformations are 3.8 times more likely to succeed. Now, these are significant findings. And aside from that, another really interesting finding is that stakeholders who feel that they have co-created in change solutions, or also these types of stories that we're telling each other, they feel 5 times more ownership than stakeholders that are just being told the solution. So this already gives us a bit of a hint on how we want to approach crafting our stories and narratives. We don't just want the most senior person to write a couple lines and use that as a story. We want to be co-creative about this. We want to have stakeholders throughout the organization continuously contribute, write, and update this story so that it can be propagated throughout the organization and really drive change, really help people understand why they're doing this and what they can do to help. In the brain, this is a very interesting topic as well, because what we see is that communicating and storytelling is something that is an innately human thing. We are not a species that runs on numbers and percentages and statistics. That's not the way that we think intuitively. Of course, we can learn these types of things, but the way that we really understand, the way that our brains make meaning out of the world around us is through stories, by creating stories. And if you're not going to tell a great story as a leader or a manager about a change or a transition, then your stakeholders are going to create their own story about it. And oftentimes this is not a very productive story because they might be very resistant or reactant towards a change. So we really have to make sure that we co-create a good story that really engages stakeholders. And what this is doing in the brain is it's clarifying what is going on. Change always brings uncertainty, but we can counter that uncertainty with clarity by creating a sort of fluency in the brain. And fluency is created through a good story. It can help people overcome mental barriers, conscious or unconscious, that they might have to contribute, to go along with this change, to see clearly what is going to happen in the future. And it also it also creates a lot of trust. It helps your audience, your stakeholders really understand what the aims and expectations, the why of a transition or a change are. This is a phenomenon that's often described as the narrative bias. So now that we know a little bit about why these change narratives work so well, let's dive into how we can actually craft them. Now, there are two tools that, I mean, there are many tools, of course, but there are two tools that I really would like to emphasize because they have been proven to work over and over. Or as we like to say, they're really evidence-based. So there's a lot of evidence that these work. And the first one is called public narrative that I also mentioned in the beginning. Now, this is a framework or a theory that was actually coined by Marshall Gans, scientist and practitioner who specializes in storytelling. And he identified these core components that each good story shares. And the best thing was that he found that this actually underlies almost each great conversation or each great story that he's ever seen. So we are talking about presidential speeches. We're talking about CEO keynotes. We are talking about any type of speech or story that really had impact. They all have the same underlying components, and they are summarized as the story of self, the story of now, and the story of us. And we're going to go into that a little bit deeper in just a second to help you create these stories for your organization. Another tool that you can use in tandem with this is called the 3-30-3-30 rule. Any type of story that you tell in impactful change needs to have a couple of levels or a couple of durations. So we usually start by telling a full story when we announce a change from the leadership level, and this would be the 30-minute version. This could be a presentation that senior leaders share, can be around 30 minutes long, and it will really go deep into the meaning, the why, the what is happening and how it's happening, and it will use this public narrative framework as well. Then you can condense that into a 3-minute version. Could fit on a one-pager, for example, or managers could share this in the beginning of a meeting. It has the same core components, but it's a lot easier to tell because it takes less time. There's also a 30-second version. This could be something that when you have this change story that is continuously being told consistently throughout the organization, at some moment, people are starting to catch on to it. Stakeholders that might not be in prominent leadership positions might still tell each other about this. These people could also be called change champions. So this is the elevator pitch, right? If you enter an elevator or you stand at the water cooler or the coffee machine, what are you going to tell each other to make sure that they're on board with this big change that is happening? And then there could also be a 3-second version. This is more like a motto or a change summarized into a couple of words to really make it stick, because it's really important that something like that sticks. So now that we know these two key tools, let's dive a little bit deeper into crafting the story and the components that are needed for that. And this requires us to go a bit deeper into public narrative. And so Marshall Gans already outlined this for us. And there are these 3 stories that you want integrated in every good narrative: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And the great thing is you don't really have to uphold a certain order. You can start wherever you want to start, but you have to make sure that these 3 components are aligned. So let's zoom a little bit deeper into what they mean. Starting with the story of now. This is a part of the narrative that helps people realize why we are doing this now. Why is it urgent? So you want... When we deal with other humans, we really want to grab their attention. And the best way to grab attention is to create positive urgency. This is signaling to the brain that this is something that we have to pay attention to now, not in 1 week, not in 1 month, but now. So the story around this could be, what challenges do we face? What could we achieve if we act? And also, what can we not achieve if we don't act? And also create some clarity. What does this require from other people in this organizations, from colleagues, from managers? So you're creating urgency, you're grabbing attention here. And then from urgency, we move into unity, or the story of us. We want to create a feeling of unity, a feeling of community, a feeling of in-group that really outlines how we are in this change together. This is not something that is being created by leadership and just being implement it over an organization. This is a change that we co-create together. And how are we doing this? How are we in this together? What binds us here? So what motivating values do we share? Often this is where leadership taps into the leadership values that they have already drafted up, or reminds people of the core values of the company. But make sure that this is integrated into the story, because this helps a lot with meaning making. And also, this is where shared goals are really important. What end goals do we share? Of course, leadership has their obligations to uphold, their responsibilities towards shareholders, but there are also things that are shareable throughout the organizations. What end goals, what common goals are we going towards? And again, I'm telling you all these tactics, these frameworks, and these dimensions, but please be mindful of the fact that these are just guidelines. These are not fixed rules. There is no order to these. This is not a mandate. These are merely tools that can help you craft an effective story. That being said, now that we had urgency, that's the story of now. We had unity, which is the story of us. What's also important is empathy, which is the story of self. Now, the messenger of a story is one of the most critical parts, because if the messenger is deemed untrustworthy or uncertainty arises from the way in which they communicate, it's not effective. So what we want to do is we want to create empathy between the messenger and the audience. So it's always important, especially at leadership level, that you put a little bit of emphasis into why this is something that you personally care about, this change. Why is this something that personally affects you? And also, if you're in a leadership position, if you're in a managerial position, but also if you're just within a team, if you're propagating this story, how will you take responsibility of the changes that are happening? What is your part? What will be your 2 cents in this change? Make sure that you signal this. And also, operationalize that even further by saying, by clarifying what people can expect from you. You are making all these promises, you're crafting a beautiful story, but also make it very clear what people can expect from you. If they call you, if they email you, what is it that they can ask from you? What is it they can expect? So again, these are just guidelines, but by having this story of self, the story of us, and the story of now, the public narrative framework that underlies all these great presidential speeches, CEO keynotes, if we harness this, if we deconstruct it, we can use it in each and every type of story that we tell as well. So to leave you, I would like to discuss how you can implement this at scale as well. So this is just a recap where we go over it again. This storytelling, narrative creation, it's all about inviting other people along the journey as well. So don't just write a narrative yourself. Don't leave it in a small group of people. Also, of course, you don't have to invite thousands of stakeholders to the writing table, but make sure you have conversations. Make sure you do some deep dives. Make sure you interview. Make sure you have heartfelt dialogue between stakeholders so that there is a lot of information to draw upon. And this doesn't have to be purely rational, right? You can ask people about how they feel about something. Use this as information that you use to craft the story. And also update this, because of course, when we have a transition or a change, this is something that propagates, right? It goes on and on and on, and the story changes. When the facts change, the story changes. Be honest about this. Update your assumptions, change your story, but make sure you do it consistently. Make sure you bring people along. Use the public narrative framework to really enter unity, empathy, and urgency, those 3 pillars that really create engagement and mobilization. Use that in your storytelling. And then when you propagate it, when you communicate a story, when you really want it to trickle down in an organization, make sure you have these different formats and guidelines. Make it easy for other stakeholders to communicate this. You want your senior leaders to be able to explain this at full force, to take 30 minutes and really get to the bottom of this. You want your managers to have a 3-minute version of this that they created themselves. They co-created this, but that has the same elements that they can use in every meeting. Ideally, at the end, you want all the people involved in such a change to have at least a 30-second version of a transition or a change in their minds, and that they can communicate as a narrative. I mean, imagine two coworkers at the water cooler, and one is asking like, hey, this huge transition that's going on, I don't really understand it. You want the other one to have the tools to just tell it in 30 seconds. This is how you can use the public narrative at scale. Now, use that, make it easy for stakeholders, pick the right format, pick the right context. And the most important thing is that you do this consistently, that you be open, that you be authentic, but that you keep communicating, which is absolutely key at the beginning, at the middle, at the end, at all points in a transition. So I cannot stress this enough. Put attention into creating your public narrative.